Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dr. Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at AHURI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this morning to this, our Cities webinar series at AHURI. To begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which all of you are living and working today. And also I want to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us and participating in this webinar. And so I do pay my respects then to elders past and present in those other places around the country as well. And also pay my respect to those Aboriginal people joining us today. And we celebrate at AHURI the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waterways of Australia. Before we commence the presentations for today's webinar, I'm pleased to remind you firstly of the upcoming National Homelessness Conference, which will be held from the 8th to Wednesday the 10th of August later this year in Canberra. And it will also be held online for those who are unable to travel to Canberra for this event. Early bird registrations are available and they close on the 4th of June. So do get in quick and be sure to register. The details are on the screen right now, so you can see those too. I now need to provide you with a few instructions on how we use the software for this webinar and also to do a bit of housekeeping. Firstly, the webinar is being recorded, so if you do want to return to it later or to forward the link to a colleague, the recording will be available on AHURI's website relatively soon after the webinar finishes, at least in the coming days. You will receive a survey too when the webinar finishes, and we'd really appreciate your feedback so that we can continue to refine and improve future webinars, and also to ensure that we're presenting information that's useful to you. To participate in today's webinar, here are some instructions for you. Okay, you'll have the opportunity to submit questions today, and you do that by typing them into the Q&A section, which is just on the right-hand side of the presentation screen on your screen. You submit your questions at any time during the presentation. You don't have to wait till the end, and we'll collate those and we'll try to address as many of them as we can during the Q&A segment, which will follow the presentations today, and I'll moderate that process for you. We have also opened up the chat function in the software, so you'll see on the same side of the screen there's a chat sign at the top of the page. You can use that to discuss the webinar with other participants while it's taking place. And perhaps to get started and to break the ice on the chat function, you may want to share with us and with the others participating what particular lands that you are joining us from today. So feel free to pop that into the chat. All right, turning our attention now to the focus of today's webinar. Firstly, I want to say this is the first in our new Cities webinar series that we're launching and we'll be holding this year. The series follows the launch of the National Cities Research Program and the inaugural Cities Research Reports that were published in 2021. Now, through this new series, we aim to examine some of the major cities and the urban policy issues in Australia. And we're looking to provide a platform where we can play a leading role in allowing policy conversation with government, with industry, which is all aimed at ensuring that Australian cities continue to be productive, livable and prosperous places for everyone. Today's webinar will look at a topic that has had much attention in the last 12 months, and that is the issue of population growth and change in regional cities around Australia. Our presenters today are Dr. Ashkay Vij from the University of South Australia and Dr. Laura Crommelin from the University of New South Wales. Vij is the lead author of AHURI's report, Understanding What Attracts New Residents to Smaller Cities. which examines the key drivers of migration flows and settlement patterns across Australia, and also identifies key barriers to and opportunities for greater population decentralisation. And Laura is the lead author of AHURI's report, Understanding the Lived Experience and Benefits of Regional Cities, which investigates the lived experience of regional city residents in 5 case studies to understand how the benefits and disadvantages of regional city life are perceived and to explore attitudes towards population growth in those places. The reports, along with the policy evidence summaries and the standalone executive summaries for each report, are now available at the AHURI website, and you can also access them directly through the handouts section, which is again in the right of your screen near the chat and the Q&A function. Akshay Vij is Associate Professor at the University of South Australia. Vij's research has made significant contributions to the development of statistical methods for the study of human behaviour and their application to transport, urban and regional development contexts. Laura Crommelin is a Senior Lecturer in the City Planning Program at UNSW Sydney. She is a Fellow at UNSW's City Futures Research Centre. Laura's research interests cover a range of trends and issues in post-industrial cities, including urban renewal, urban governance, and digital disruption, like Airbnb and so forth. She's interested also in place branding and in DIY urban revitalisation practices. Today, we also welcome Diva Hopkins, who will respond to the 2 presentations. Diva Hopkins is a Senior Economist at the Regional Australia Institute. She has worked as an economist for more than a decade and focuses on Australia's residential construction sector and housing markets. At the RAI, in addition to focusing on regional housing markets, her work covers regional labour markets and also regional migration flows. So the format for today's webinar is we will hear a short presentation from each of the 2 researchers, and then that will be followed by a response from Diva. And then after that, I will facilitate a discussion amongst our 3 presenters, as well as take questions from you as you listen to the presentations today. So again, please do put your questions into the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen at any time through the presentation. Anyway, that's enough of me. It's now my pleasure to hand over to our first presenter, which is Laura Crommelin, and Laura will introduce the project and then hand over to Vij, and she will return again after that to make her full presentation. So over to you now, Laura. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Tom, and thank you for having us here. It's really great to be talking about this research. So I'm just going to give a quick framing of where this project fits into a broader body of work that we've been doing for AHURI. And the way that this works is the 2 projects that Vij and I've completed and are presenting today are part of a broader inquiry. And that inquiry is led by Professor Andrew Beer out of the University of South Australia. That was looking at this question of population growth in Australia's smaller cities. And then the projects that we've worked on, and also an additional project led by Jago Dodson at RMIT, slot in to support that broader inquiry and its goals. So that broad inquiry really had 2 main questions that all of our projects speak to. The first was, what is the role that Australia's smaller cities can play in managing national population growth? And the second was, which policy instruments and programs are most likely to redirect population movements to these locations? So to start to answer those questions, and there will be more answers to come as Jago's report and the final inquiry report are released. But the 2 pieces that we're talking about today look at these questions with 2 different approaches. Vij's work takes a more statistical approach, survey-based approach at tackling this question of what attracts people to regional centres. And then my work, the team that I worked with were based on the ground in these cities, undertaking focus groups and speaking to residents who are there, understanding why they came and why they stay, or whether maybe they're not considering staying long term. So understanding some of those decisions in the kind of the real world context. So hopefully that gives a bit of context, and without any further ado, I'll hand over to Vish to talk through his project before coming back to looking at my research. Thanks, Vish.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Tom. I'll get started. Let's see. All right. Just a quick acknowledgement of the other people that contributed to this report and the presentation. Ali Ardashri, research fellow, Andrew Beer, professor, both out of UniSA. I'm going to be representing the team. All right, here we go. So regional cities, they probably haven't been this popular in a very long time. But lest we forget, this wasn't always the case. So obviously, prior to the pandemic, especially in the last 10 years, there's been a steady exodus of people out of the regions to bigger cities in search of better employment opportunities, education opportunities, etc. And so this study, as Laura mentioned, was largely motivated by a pre-pandemic context of trying to understand what can be done to encourage resettlement in these smaller cities and reverse some of this migration patterns. The study started in the middle of 2020. The primary data collection exercise that forms the bedrock of much of what I'll be talking about happened in early 2021. So it was very much in the throes of the pandemic. So obviously the findings to some extent likely capture the dynamics and the flux that's likely to be brought on by the pandemic, but it's also the data collection did take place relatively quickly in the wake of the first outbreaks. And so there's likely a long process to this, and disruptions in migration and settlement patterns that we're seeing right now may or may not persist. I think this quote from the Center for Population, where they surveyed a number of experts, is really useful, where basically they found that about half of the experts believe that these changes in migration patterns that we're seeing are likely not to persist, and we are likely to fall back to pre-pandemic patterns, whereas the other half did expect a more long-term shift in favor of migration from capital cities to regional areas. So hopefully some of the findings from the study can offer insight on this question, but as I mentioned, this is very much a process that is still evolving, and I think it's important that we keep an eye out on this, because definitive answers are not likely to emerge immediately. So with that as background, there's two key objectives to this research. One, just at a high level, examine the key drivers of migration flows and settlement patterns, and then really from there draw out how government can support greater population decentralization, and what are the different ways in which we can encourage resettlement in smaller regional cities and take some of the pressure off our big metropolitan areas. All right, so the primary data, as I mentioned, was collected in early 2021. Basically, we did a large nationwide survey of about 3,000 people. This was an online survey. The survey was about 20 minutes. We asked questions around their residential and migration histories, their attitudes towards both small and large cities. So large cities were defined as anything with a population of greater than 100,000. And regional or small cities or mid-sized cities were defined as cities with populations of under 100,000. I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail in the next set of slides. So just first, at a high level, our sample was largely demographically and geographically representative of the Australian population. So here we're just comparing the split across gender and age groups between our sample and the Australian population. Obviously, it's not a perfect representation, but the important thing is that we have coverage across all age groups and sufficient coverage to be able to offer statistically meaningful insights. Same idea with geography, good spread across the states and territories. Then getting into the residential and migration history. So this is where stuff starts to get a little interesting. So at a high level, roughly 17% of our sample currently lives in a mid-sized city, and about 83% currently lives in a large city. This is consistent very much so with the Australian national population. What's interesting though is, of course, because we designed the survey, we can gather additional insights in terms of previous migration histories. I think what's interesting is that about 70% of the Australian population, we estimate, has always lived in a large city. We are one of the most urbanized nations in the world, so that's not a surprise. What's probably also interesting is about 8 to 9% have migrated from a smaller town to a large city, whereas about 6% have migrated in the reverse direction. So while at a net level, there is obviously out-migration, what's interesting is that the direction is not always one way, and it's not necessarily as heavily skewed as one would imagine. This one's obviously a very busy slide, so I don't expect you to take it all in. What we have in the columns are different segments of the population, depending on their migration history. So this big block here are people who currently live in a mid-sized city. This big block here currently live in a large city. And then just how have they ended up in these cities? What's the history driving that? What's interesting in the rows, so the rows have been ordered in terms of decreasing importance of reasons for why people live in the cities that they presently live in. Obviously, employment comes out on top, being close to family and place of birth. So obviously there's some inertia where you were born and raised. You obviously have deep familial ties to that place, so not surprising. The next big factor is quality of life, and then education. And education, as you can see, is often a very strong determinant for why people moved from a mid-sized city to a large city. So about 19% of people who currently live in a mid-sized city did in the past move to a large city for access to better education. About 14% who currently lived in large cities but used to live in mid-sized cities also moved for the same exact reason. So at a high level, employment, quality of life, and education tend to be the most important determinants, and then other factors being housing, attractive environment, etc. All right. Then just some high-level attitudes and perceptions of both small and large cities. I think this chart is quite interesting. So we basically asked respondents to rate on average how they perceive a small city with a population of less than 100,000 in terms of these attributes, and then also to compare it to a large city in the terms of the same attributes. So the dark red bars are smaller towns, the light red bars are larger cities. And as you can see, almost across the majority of attributes such as great place to live, access to nature, ease of getting around, safety, etc., small cities tend to perform better. Large cities, as you'd imagine, tend to perform better when it comes to access to art and culture, nightlife, shopping, dining, etc., and also good places for investment. In terms of places to work and study, both sort of end up being rated relatively evenly, so there's not as much of a difference. What will be interesting, of course, is to see how these perceptions and attitudes play out when it comes to actual decisions and preferences for settlement. Which brings me to the next component of the survey, which was the centerpiece of the survey in some sense, a state preference experiment, where each respondent, so everybody in our sample, we had 3,000 people, each person was shown 8 different scenarios where they were offered a choice to live between 2 different cities that vary in terms of the attributes shown here. So population size, unemployment rate, climate, distance to the coast, etc., etc. Also for reference, we showed them the same attributes for their current city of residence, so Adelaide in my case. And then for each of these 8 scenarios, we varied the attributes of the 2 cities systematically based on a statistical design. And respondents were asked to rate for each scenario which city they would prefer to live in. just some more details in terms of the experiment design. So these were the different values that were selected for each of the 9 attributes. And they were systematically varied to make sure we had enough coverage across the different attributes and that we were able to estimate the marginal effect of each. Now, the findings I've tried to summarize in terms of this big table. Again, just don't pay attention to the details right now. I'll walk you through this table. At a high level, what I want to mention is our analysis identified 4 different segments or classes in the sample population based on their preferences for different cities, different attributes of the cities, their attitudes, and then their own demographic characteristics. We've ordered the classes. So class 1 is most enthusiastic about living in a large city. Class 4 is most enthusiastic about living in a smaller town, and the classes are ordered in decreasing preference for large cities and increasing preference for smaller towns. So as I said, I'll just quickly try to give you a flavor of what each class is about. So class 1, as I said, have a very strong preference for large cities. They're only about 16% of the sample population based on our estimates. These people, it's unlikely that you're going to persuade them to move to a smaller town. They have always lived in large cities, are reluctant to leave. They care about a lot of things, in particular, some of those art and cultural attributes or amenities that are much more easily available in large cities. As you'd expect, these people are young, high-income professionals that are usually single or partnered but don't have children, so they're either double income, no kids households, DINK households, or young urban professionals. Makes sense that larger cities with access to greater cultural offerings would hold a greater draw for these people. At the other end of the spectrum, you had about 9% of the sample population that has a similarly strong preference for smaller cities. Similarly, it's unlikely that you'll be able to persuade them to move to a larger city. And then they tend to be at the other end of the life cycle, more likely to be older, lower income individuals without a college degree that are either employed part-time or retired, so further along in the life cycle. So that's about 25%. The remaining 75% are people who are somewhere in the middle and who are up for grabs in some sense, who are open to changing their mind and could be persuaded to move to a smaller city. Class 2 really cares about unemployment rates and employment opportunities in general. That's their primary motivation for where they live. They're highly likely to be currently living in a large city. They have lived in a mid-sized city in the past. They're open to moving to one again, but most likely they're living in a large city right now because of access to employment. At the same time, they do not view large cities as good places to live. So they're there in some sense because they have no other option, or that's at least how they perceive their situation. But they definitely be open to moving to a smaller city. They tend to be, again, on the younger side of the age and life cycle spectrum. So they're either young or middle-aged individuals, more likely to have children, tend to be university educated, employed full-time in high-wage, white-collar jobs and sectors. So the kinds of jobs that are likely to be much more available in larger cities, which explains both their circumstances as well as their preferences. Class 3, which is much larger, about half of the sample population, they're what you'd call rational consumers from an economic jargon standpoint. So they are really sensitive to all sorts of attributes. They're making considered trade-offs between living costs, average wages, housing costs, and all sorts of other quality of life factors. These people also, they're generally reflective of the Australian population in terms of their split across large and mid-sized cities. They tend to also view mid-sized cities as good places to retire, but not necessarily good places to work or study, right? And so they're viewing mid-sized cities as a potential place to move to once they've started to downscale their work or move into partial or full retirement. And as you'd expect, they're much more likely to be again older, further along in the life cycle, either already employed part-time or already in retirement. So just to summarize the findings, obviously there's strong life cycle effects. In some sense, the findings aren't super surprising. So as you'd expect, young adults are much more likely to be open to moving due to education and employment opportunities. Middle-aged adults are more likely motivated primarily by employment opportunities. And then as you get further along in the life cycle, people are looking more for post-retirement living support, and that tends to be the primary motivator. And so then just moving to my final slide, what does it all mean in terms of policy? So options 1 and 2, develop more education or employment opportunities. These are classic policy instruments that have been used in Australia for the last 3, 4, 5 decades in an attempt to disperse population and take some of the pressure off the bigger cities. Hasn't necessarily worked in the past. Honestly, it's at least my personal opinion is things haven't changed fundamentally that dramatically for there to be a strong case for why they will work in the future. A lot of empirical evidence seems to suggest that governments have fairly limited power in generating economies when there's not really a clear comparative advantage or a clear natural comparative advantage. And so there's only so much that can be done to force the matter. Personally, options 3 and 4 are probably much more viable. 3 in particular, this is where the pandemic comes in, as people are able to work remotely much more so. This could probably disperse population and could offer opportunities for regional settlement, particularly as a greater proportion of the workforce transitions into entirely remote working arrangements, where they're not required at all to be physically present in an office. That would definitely enable. The other big option is to develop regional centers as retirement hubs and basically invest in post-retirement infrastructure in terms of healthcare, access to other amenities, etc. One point that's interesting is that as healthcare has gotten better and as people are in much better health, even post-retirement, encouraging settlement from older adults in regional Australia is going to drive much more economic activity than it would in the past, because people are well and truly still engaged in economic activity into their late 60s and 70s, etc. And so there's really an opportunity here as well to use that to the benefit of regional communities. That's it for me. I'll stop here, hand it back to you, Laura.
Many thanks, Vij, and there's lots of things that cross over there with the work that I'm going to talk about now, so I think it'll make for a great discussion. So, as I said, this project looks at the lived experience and the benefits of regional living as perceived by the people who are doing it, so regional residents and also stakeholders, key stakeholders in regional areas. And before I start, I should acknowledge also my co-authors on this work. It certainly wasn't a solo effort. Todd Denham at RMIT, Lawrence Troy at the University of Sydney, Julia Gilbert and Stephanie Dura at the University of South Australia, and Jason Harrison and Simon Pinnegar here at UNSW. So all hands on deck. We had two main questions going into this project. The first was, what are the place-based experiences of residents? So quite a broad opportunity to talk to regional residents about how they were finding the experience of living in a regional area. And then trying to dig into those questions about the benefits and how those play out in terms of housing and employment outcomes and possible trade-offs that regional residents might make between those different factors in deciding whether to move and to stay in a regional area. As the research went on, we sort of added in a couple of additional issues that really came to the fore in the context of doing this research during COVID-19. So we're seeing more and more of the growth that was happening organically in regional areas. So talking to residents about how they felt about growth became quite important. And also COVID-19, how that was impacting people's experiences was very much front of mind. I won't pick up too much on that here, but I'm certainly happy to dig into that more in the discussion if people are interested. So what we did was we did focus groups in 5 regional cities. They were open to any residents who wanted to come along and talk about their experiences, and we had a mix of long-term and newer residents in those focus groups, and also stakeholder interviews with interviewees from local government, service providers, major employers, those kinds of key players in shaping employment and lifestyle experiences in regional areas. We had 5 case study cities. These were chosen to try and get as much diversity as possible in the types of regional places we were looking at. So across 4 different states, a range of sizes of cities, from Wollongong as the biggest down to Whyalla as the smallest. Cities that were experiencing different levels of growth. So Cairns undergoing quite significant growth in recent times, whereas Whyalla is really sort of stable or even declining, has been certainly declining over the past 30 years more broadly. So very different experiences there in terms of what's happening regarding growth. And also a diversity of places in terms of the kind of industrial strengths, whether it's heavy industry, education, agriculture, defence in the case of Albury-Wodonga, and I guess different levels of opportunities as a result in terms of employment opportunities in these different cities. So sort of trying to, as best as we could with 5 cities, capture the diversity of different places that get bundled up in this idea of regional Australia. So first, the benefits. What did people tell us they liked about living in regional cities? These were the sort of the top 4 that really came through strongly. The ease of getting around, the fact that you have short commutes, you have more free time to spend on leisure or with your family. Housing was certainly a big draw card. It was cheaper to access housing in most of these cities. It was more affordable and more spacious housing. You could get more for your money. And so that lifestyle aspect of having more space and not having to pay as much for it, certainly a big part of the appeal. Lots of people talked about this sense of community and belonging, the kind of the feel, the sense that you knew people, you bumped into people. People talked about the fact that it takes twice as long to go shopping in Whyalla because you run into every second person you know in the supermarket. And that was very much something that people enjoyed about regional living. And access to natural environments, some incredible natural places that were very easily accessible. The Daintree from Cairns, Mungo Mungo National Park from Mildura. So having that right at your doorstep rather than it having to be something you sort of went on a trip to access. And reflecting on all this as a whole, I guess, it came through that amenity was kind of the it factor. So it was the thing that excited people about moving to a regional area. It was what made a regional move appealing for those people who had moved. And so it was sort of the spark that lit the match, but then you still needed the other elements to stack up. And some of those key things that Vij was talking about, education, employment opportunities, access to appropriate housing, those pieces still needed to be there, but the amenity question was what prompted people to start thinking about it and try to make it work. And I guess just to capture that, I'll just read one quote from one of our participants. It said, "I decided, looking at all the other people in the same industry sector that I was, that there was no quality of life. I watched people having to strive to make huge incomes and not be able to afford their lifestyle. I watched people do it and I saw them all fail and be miserable. So my husband's family were from up here, so we decided to see if we could be close to family support. It was lifestyle. I did not want to be working in the big city, commuting an hour, raising children." There were also disadvantages, certainly, of regional living, and here career, I think, really came to the fore, particularly for people in more professional career paths. There was a sense that you might get one good opportunity, but actually stringing together a series of good opportunities could be quite challenging. A number of participants talked about having to take pay cuts, and that once they did that, the benefits of cheaper housing and some of those other things didn't quite, have such an impact. Services was incredibly high on the list of things people were concerned about, healthcare and education right at the top of that list. And that was something that really cut across all of the regional centres that we spoke to, slightly less so in the case of Wollongong because of that access to services in Sydney. But in Wollongong, there was still that concern because of the fact people were being pushed further and further out of Wollongong due to housing affordability pressures. So the benefit that had come from being close to Sydney was disappearing for those people as they were pushed further south. A lot of participants talked about concerns around declining housing affordability, particularly in the rental sector, and the fact that there wasn't much by way of social housing to try and pick up and fill the gap for people who weren't being able to make things work in the private rental sector anymore. So that real key benefit that has been a draw card is certainly going backwards, or at least that was the perception, and that's certainly we've seen that fleshed out in the statistics that have come out in recent times as well. And again, some concerns that there was less access to cultural and sporting events, some of those big ticket things. This was something that primarily came out in the more remote centres where, you really had to get on a plane to get to a big city if you wanted to go to a major sporting match. But for the most part, that was something that people, were prepared to trade off because of the other benefits that they saw they were getting. So again, just I guess to give add a little bit of colour to that, a quote from one of our participants talking about the trade-offs in the employment context. And they said, "I'm quite fortunate because I've got a couple of uni degrees and an MBA. I guess coming to a town like this, it was, I don't know what the right word is, but unappealing, I guess, the jobs market compared to what would be available in Melbourne or Sydney or even Adelaide for that matter. So you can see why young people leave. I certainly didn't move here for work. It was for family reasons and everything, which were the right decisions for us as a family. But I've learnt to probably be more complacent career-wise." So people talked also about parking their ego and some of those kind of adjustments that they made to their expectations to make their career work in smaller regional cities. Coming then to the question of growth. This is a really interesting topic. I think there's often a perception that, people are hesitant or concerned about growth, and we did hear that quite a lot. But in general, I think people's attitudes to growth were very nuanced. There was a pretty clear recognition that growth could bring benefits in terms of better services, more infrastructure, some of those kinds of things that regional areas felt they needed. But there was a fair amount of scepticism about whether those kind of benefits would come at the same time as the growth, or whether there would be that lag period and that in between you would lose the amenity, the short commutes, the easy living kind of lifestyle, while you waited for things like infrastructure to catch up. A key concern was the fact that people already perceived essential services like health in particular to be under strain, and so the sense was that if we grow, maybe that will help that in the long term, but in the short time, there'll be even more pressure on those services. People talked about the difficulty of accessing specialists and also, even getting GP appointments in a number of these cities. Concerns about the environmental impacts. A number of the cities were in areas where, particularly Cairns, I guess, you have very vulnerable and important environmental features that are a big part of what attract people to the area, but are under pressure from expanding housing and other infrastructure. And similarly with agricultural land. So working out how to get that balance right of growing, still having the lifestyle, the bigger house, that sort of appealing aspect of small town living, but not putting too much pressure on the environment is a really tricky one to navigate. And lastly, I think it's important to note that, particularly in Whyalla, there was real enthusiasm for growth because there was a recognition that going backwards brings even worse challenges in some ways than actually growing. So there was a sense that, you need to maintain that critical mass, and I guess maybe a sense that with all the focus on what's happening to manage growth and how we're going to manage growth, those places that weren't growing were maybe being a little bit forgotten in the discussion. The other thing that I guess comes through from this is, while we were looking for similarities and sort of shared narratives across these places, there were so many ways in which they really were very different. And so this sort of tendency to talk about regional Australia as one kind of thing, once you get on the ground, it's very clear how, that masks a lot of what's really important and what's going on in different places. So number of really localized themes that require attention, that need the particular places to be the focus and the centre of where that planning is coming from. The administrative complexities of the cities, we have 2 cities on the border, and both of those, particularly in the context of COVID, have had an incredibly challenging time with border closures. But even without border closures, just the layers of administration that get added once you have, a need to register a business in New South Wales and Victoria, or managing employees who work in both places, all of those kinds of challenges, and a sense that you've got twice as many governments who are responsible for you now as a city that's just in one jurisdiction. The role of some of these cities as support hubs for broader regional areas, I think, came through very clearly, and that changes the whole dynamic in terms of what you need to do in terms of services and thinking about capacity and those things. So looking at these places like Mildura or Cairns in isolation misses the fact that they play such an important role in the broader region. The change of key industries in places like Wollongong and Whyalla, where you had that sort of core business of the steelworks, and what had been lost as that had sort of declined, not just the employment opportunities, but also a whole network of support services that needed to be picked up by governments. People talked a lot about, when you used to arrive in Whyalla, how much support there was for you as a new resident that was put in place by the company, and now that wasn't necessarily available, and that there was a role there for government to step in. And then the question of satellite cities like Wollongong, there's a very different dynamic there once you have people who are living in the place but not necessarily working there, and trying to work out how you get the benefits of that, while also juggling the disadvantages, and housing affordability is the clear pressure in the Wollongong context when people have Sydney salaries but are living in Wollongong. So lots of really local things that need to be tackled at that local scale. So just to wrap up, I would say that one of the things that was really interesting was, despite those differences, people in all of these case studies talked about how they felt that there was a town feel, that they liked the community, the sense of community. So that's not necessarily a function of size specifically, it's a part of a broader kind of question of identity and how the town or the city operates, its spatial structure, some of those factors as well. So there is room for these places to grow and still retain that if it's done properly. There was a real sense that a lot of the policy debate at the moment was, how can we, solve the problems of the big cities, rather than how can we do growth in a way that really benefits regional residents and is about their interests primarily, rather than something that happens to them. So I think that part of the conversation needs to be making sure that regional cities and places and residents feel that they're very much part of the conversation and driving the decisions that get made. And just lastly, reiterating that point that if we don't do growth well, if we don't plan properly for it, you'll lose that it factor, and it might become a kind of a self-defeating exercise if you grow too fast and no longer have those kinds of, easy living aspects that are a big part of what is attracting people to regional centres. So planning is really right at the heart of how we do this properly, at least. So I think that's all from me. I'll hand back over, I think, to Tom, and then we'll hear from Diva as well. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Laura, and thank you, Vij, also. We really appreciated the insights that you've presented from your two respective research pieces as part of this inquiry. So I'd like now to hand over to Diva Hopkins to give some of her reflections on what we've heard this morning. Over to you.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Laura and Vij, for sharing your research. It's really interesting research, and it's also very instructive and a really valuable contribution to that discussion that's receiving a lot of prominence around population growth and that distribution of population growth between capitals and regional areas. And that's something that the Regional Australia Institute, we're especially interested in this topic. We're very vested in this topic because we're currently in the process of developing our own regionalisation framework. And so I suppose in that context and with that background of the work that we're doing at the Institute, what really stands out for me, Laura, in your work in particular, is that question and that sort of guiding principle, I suppose, for policymakers that you pointed out at the end there is who is population growth for, and does it benefit regional people and those places. And for us at the Institute, this idea of regionalisation, rebalancing that population growth and the distribution of that population growth, central to that is that it is for the benefit of all Australians, so for capital city people and regional people alike. And so, but I'll just, go back to Vij's work, I suppose, and what was really interesting to me and what was very edifying was just that sort of closer look at those population dynamics in relation to those, looking at mid-size versus larger size cities and what those dynamics are. And it's interesting that you've built on the work that the Institute has done. The Institute looks a lot at these sort of population migration flows and dynamics. One of our reports in recent years found that if you look at sort of capital cities relative to total non-capital city areas, those migration flows from capital cities to regional Australia as a whole is they're bigger than the flows the other way around. But I think your contribution here in terms of looking at those, looking at that, taking that sort of different methodological approach and looking specifically at those mid-sized areas and showing that actually they're losing residents more than they are gaining residents from those larger cities is important for policymakers to be mindful of in terms of those policy responses. I suppose the big question then in terms of these population flows is now, what the implications of COVID, what the disruption of COVID has meant for these population flows. And I just wanted to point out and share that at the Institute, we're very interested in these population flows, and we've been monitoring them in work that we do with the Commonwealth Bank. We track their customer relocations. And just some really interesting dynamics that we've been monitoring, and it goes to this idea of amenity, and the idea that the finding is in Laura's work that local amenity and sort of the natural attraction there as being a strong driver, and Vij in your work that sort of location to coast, distance to coastline is a strong driver. What we've seen in our analysis of these relocations from capital cities into regions is that those bigger cities, they do account for the largest flows, but when you look at the smaller areas that are seeing significant growth in that capital city out migration, what we saw this time last year those cities tended to be those coastal areas. But what we're now seeing is increasingly those regions and those areas that are experiencing very strong growth, they're increasingly inland areas. And we think what's underscoring that is housing affordability and these housing pressures that are really widespread that Laura, you mentioned was one of those key drivers in terms of those decisions and, what part of that lived experience. So, yeah, and I suppose that the final thing to conclude on here, just in responding, is just the approach of understanding and really setting out that diversity of regional Australia and the diversity, the different sizes of different regional settings and therefore the different experiences is just really instructive for policymakers, for industry in terms of approaching this question. So look, I'll leave it there and so that we can get into the Q&A.
Thanks, Diva. We appreciate those thoughts to kick us off with our Q&A discussion. Thanks, everybody who's been putting questions forward. I've really appreciated that. And I'm going to do my best to incorporate some of the specific questions and certainly all of the themes that have been raised by people through that. I thought we might start the discussion really in the COVID space, given that has been such obviously a big factor in a lot of changes, and also you started your project. COVID came along right at the start of that, and really you've been on your research journey right through it. It's going to be, I guess, difficult to be definitive, but I'm wondering if you can just, and I'm particularly asking, I guess, Laura and Vish initially, if you can sort of talk a bit about your perception of, I guess, the role of COVID. Has it been predominantly an accelerator of underlying trends that were already happening? That might have been because of housing affordability issues in capital cities. It might have been due to growth pressures on capital cities. It might be because of the aging of the population and retirement choices, that kind of thing. How can you sort of disentangle those trends from the COVID impact? And can you talk a bit about whether you think it's an accelerator of those or whether it's bringing something different again? Maybe I'll go to you first, Vish, and you can hand over to the others.
Sure. Thanks, Doug. In transport, we have this idea that there's a fixed travel time budget, and basically for the last 100 or so years, people have spent the same amount of their daily time getting around. And as technology's gotten better and faster modes of transport, people have lived further, and that's driven sprawl, right? So remote working is not a transport technology strictly, but if people can work remotely 2 or 3 days a week, that's potentially 40 to 60% less time that they're spending commuting. And that effectively, by that same logic, expands the city boundary by 40 to 60% if travel times and speeds remain the same. So in some sense, I think COVID-19 and working from home is going to exacerbate sprawl. And that in that sense, it's just accelerating trends that we've already seen, where Sydney at this point is this massive, 5-pole center with 2-hour commutes being the norm. But in some ways, it's also changing structural patterns. And I think mid-sized cities will probably profit the most in the long run. I do think we're seeing, obviously, regional housing markets are hotter than they've ever been. But I think some of that is reactionary. I'm not sure to what extent small regional cities can support employment opportunities of the kind that would usually be available to white-collar occupation or workers in large cities. But Adelaide in particular, when I moved to Adelaide 4 years ago, I was told it was the city that Australians go to die. And I don't think that joke's made anymore at our expense. If anything, I think the joke is more on Sydney and Melbourne now. And you can see how Adelaide's never had a hotter housing market. We've never been this popular. Housing affordability really wasn't an issue here until literally a year ago. And that's because it's got that sweet size, right? It's a 1 million strong city. It has fringe. It has those art and cultural options that people want in a big city, but it's still a 20 or a 30-minute city. So it's got a bit of the best of both worlds. And I think that's probably what's going to play out. Gold Coast, other mid-sized cities are probably going to, mid-size being about 1 million and not less than 100,000. That, in my opinion, are probably going to profit the most.
Thanks, and a great sales pitch for Adelaide there, Fish. Laura, what are your thoughts about the pandemic effects?
Yeah, look, I think I'd reach a fairly similar conclusion. Vish said, he thinks particularly mid-sized cities would benefit, and I would argue I think it'll be primarily cities that are still within striking distance of the major metropolitan areas that will see the most COVID-related growth. I think that regional growth that was already happening before, so I think your framing of this COVID as an accelerator, I think is a good one. Certainly the pressures that we saw on lifestyle and commuting and all those things, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, well and truly predate COVID. But I think COVID has given people the opportunity to imagine that a regional move is possible in a way that maybe they were unsure whether that was the case before. And I think the other thing that it will do, there was certainly some enthusiasm in some of the regional areas amongst people who wanted to see growth, that they would see an influx of people coming with work from home jobs, and that would be a kind of a new segment of growth. I'm probably a little bit hesitant to say that I think that is going to be a significant factor, but I think what you may well see is people who still are making the move for those other reasons, family, lifestyle, and it might be a way that they can sort of, the ease of work from home now in the post-COVID era, or the COVID era, if we're still in it, the ease of that might allow you to fill gaps. So maybe, you find a job in a regional centre that works for a couple of years, maybe then you find something that you can do partially online that you make that work for a little while before you find the next opportunity. So there's that sort of added flexibility to how you shape your career now that maybe wasn't there before. So I do think it will help some people, but I'm holding my breath to see if places that aren't within sort of easy striking distance of a major capital city see long-term growth as a result of COVID.
And Diva, the Regional Australia Institute, what's the thinking there about, Vij started his presentation saying that there was got almost a 50-50 split amongst experts about whether this was a permanent structural change or whether it was a temporary effect. What does the Institute think, and what kind of things are you preparing for?
Look, at the Institute, so I mentioned this regionalisation framework that we're developing. So we're champions of regional Australia, and so we're optimistic about about these changes. Understandably, they're coming with a lot of challenges and growing pains, but I think that shift to acceptance of online and remote working will be significant, and you can see that policy and increasingly, industry is starting to respond accordingly. So in New South Wales, for example, the New South Wales government has a policy whereby you can work remotely. And so that really goes to that issue that Laura's research highlighted, that, the sort of career opportunities, particularly in these smaller areas that don't have that striking distance, that's a real barrier to that movement. So and so what we're doing at the Institute here is working with industry, working with our sort of corporate members to see, how it is that those, that the adoption of working from home and, how sort of in-region career development can be something that is addressed, that's not seen sort of as a detractor. And it's encouraging that, you're already seeing the New South Wales government, for example, move in that kind of direction. I mean, and just, I suppose, going to the other points around, just more broadly about whether this is sort of a flash in the pan or if this is going to be sort of more of a structural change. The affordability issues are just so acute in capital cities, with this, really low interest rates and the sort of corresponding increases in housing prices. It's just, I think it's such a strong driver, and we think that that's underscoring this increasing move to regional areas that are sort of increasingly inland, is that affordability, and in coastal areas where they are sort of high amenity, where affordability starts to diminish there. So I think that's a very significant driver. I suppose the only thing is, what the sort of cycle of interest rates and price down cycles, how that sort of bears out in the sort of relativities of, how that bears out in capital cities versus in regions. There's a lot of talk around sort of capital city house prices likely to be sort of going down, but in regions, because of this sort of underlying structural shortage in housing, there's probably a bit more, that price response of declining prices to interest rates is probably going to lag. And so there's affordability issues, I imagine, that are creeping up into regions, might still be at play for some time yet. So the dynamics of that will just, be interesting to see.
Yeah. And this might be a good chance now to segue, I guess, to discussing the question of housing and particularly the affordability of it. There's been quite a lot of questions come in that are focused on that issue, and maybe I'll go back to you, Laura, to kick off on this. But just I guess to narrow in on a question, It seems, as Diva was saying, that a lot of the, and I guess initial or early movement to and motivation to move to regions was driven by, what was perceived as better opportunity, partly because of the opportunity to own a house or to find better housing or better located housing in terms of amenity in regional centres and other areas, but clearly, these markets have also been, very significantly growing and also becoming very constrained in terms of availability of rental housing. And how are we seeing a sort of then a subsequent shift in that motivation? What's happening now? Was there an initial phase of movement that has sort of ebbed off a bit because of the increases in pricing, or have we just seen no direct relationship between those factors?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and I think I'm not sure that we sort of really even have the data yet to get a sense of the current dynamics. It was certainly, most of the people that we spoke to had been there for a little while, so they weren't sort of really recent arrivals. So they had come at a time when they felt like that was an opportunity to get access to the sort of housing that they wanted. So it would be really interesting and useful, I think, to speak to people who had arrived in the last 6 months or so and get a feel as to whether they were actually able to make that housing affordability element work for them, particularly when they factor that in against a possible kind of reduction in wages that a number of our participants talked about. So I think, look, it's really changing as we watch. But I would, also say that particularly in a number of these places, again, we're seeing this exacerbate issues that were already there. So certainly Wollongong had housing affordability concerns that well and truly predated COVID. Cairns, the growth that's happened in Cairns and the dual strain of rapid growth and also a significant tourist market that has led into taking up housing through things like Airbnb has made that a really challenging housing market for some time. So in some ways, COVID shone a light on these problems that were already there, but they're not new issues. So I think, look, it's. I think the other thing that was coming through in our conversations, and that is maybe a sort of a part of the discussion about housing affordability in regional areas that hasn't been as prominent, that is going to be increasingly prominent, is the rental market.
Yeah.
The idea was you move to a regional area and you buy something, and if that's becoming increasingly difficult or for even local people who, grow up there and want to buy, that's difficult, then there are going to be more and more people turning to rental property as the only option. And it was very clear in the conversations that we had that there's a real scarcity.
Yeah, that's right. And Vich, can you add anything to that in terms of some of the data analysis that you've done in the regions in terms of, I'm thinking particularly around lower income households, households that were renting in regional towns and maybe had been for some time. What we know is that increased scarcity of rental availability and also prices rising. How is that impacting lower income households who don't own a home?
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely speak to the preferences part. So housing affordability was just in the top 5 under quality of life as a factor for why people move. So it's definitely up there. I think it probably gets wrapped up in broader quality of life issues, so affordability being one measure of it. I mean, I'd largely echo what Laura said in that the jury is still out. Again, just speaking purely from my personal experience and anecdotal information, Adelaide, I mean, all the people that are driving up the property prices here are not necessarily local residents. They're people moving in from Sydney and Melbourne. Auctions weren't a thing 3 years ago. Now pretty much any house is going up by auction. So, I mean, there's obviously been a lot of changes because of that. Again, it's hard to say whether they'll persist long term or in 3 or 4 years the Sydney siders get bored of Adelaide and move back. We don't know. I'm also interested in latching on to Peter McMillan's question of why is it taking so long to acknowledge the role that housing plays in enabling and constraining population and economic development. I mean, my answer to that, and at the risk of saying too much, is that a lot of Australian wealth, in my opinion, has been built on top of an inflated property market. And I've actually had conversations with multiple government actors where even the merits of housing affordability as an end objective have been questioned, which to me was quite startling, because to me it was axiomatic. Of course, we want affordable housing. What kind of society are we in if we want, unnecessarily inflated markets? But that's clearly not to the benefit of people who profit off, multi-million-dollar properties in Sydney and Melbourne. And sadly, those people are in power. And so housing affordability has usually been marginalized. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Yeah, that's all good. So I guess to connect that housing affordability conversation with another issue that you both raised and which also has come up in the questions around, I guess, growth and change in regional centres and provision of, I think, Laura, you mentioned that question about whether other services and infrastructure is keeping pace with growth. It sounds like it probably isn't, but whether that there's that, I guess, that expectation that the growth will enable or make viable other forms of development that provide the services that people need. How is housing as a service, as infrastructure, I guess, fitting into that equation? To what extent is provision of affordable rental housing actually factoring into some of those conversations that people are having in those regional centres?
Yeah, look, I think you have to look at all of these things as interconnected, and certainly, we talked about the sort of challenge of accessing services as something that is a concern for regional people. But if you're talking about people, low-income people, the fact that you, in many cases in regional areas, have to travel to somewhere else to access services is also a financial imposition. Yeah. It's expensive to fly from these regional areas, or it takes a long time to drive. We're seeing the price of petrol going up. That means that that's getting more and more expensive. So the more that, on the very basic level, the more people are spending to be able to secure housing, the more they're going to have to, pinch their pennies in order to be able to do things like access services that they need. And I think that, that thing that we're seeing already, certainly in Wollongong, of the kind of the pushing out of lower income people into more and more sort of, smaller regional cities and sort of more rural areas is a real challenge, because once, the provision of service is easier the more condensed people are. And so if you have people kind of clustering in key regional areas, then providing services is not so challenging. But the housing affordability issue is actually counteracting that by pushing people out to more remote areas, and then they have to get back into the major regional hubs to access services. So I think, the more that we see that housing affordability issue grow, the more we're going to see people living in places where they have less and less access to those services they need.
Yeah. Diva, I might just jump over to you also to ask, what the from the perspective of the Institute, how, what you're seeing and how, what you're doing, or what conversations you're having around that, provision of more affordable housing for particularly for lower income people or key workers as well in regional areas. It's certainly at AHURI, it's something that we hear a lot about from a lot of our stakeholders in regional locations as well, about things really, I think, getting to a bit of a crisis point in some areas in terms of inability of a lot of households to actually afford to be living in many places in regional Australia. What's the Institute, or what sort of things are you hearing, and what are you doing?
Yeah. So I just want to go back to this, to the point around rental markets in particular, because I think this is really important when to distinguish rental markets from purchase markets when we look at regional housing markets. Because I think the sort of conversation and the sort of general analysis kind of out there in sort of the media, when we look at housing, the sort of impulse is to understand those dynamics in relation to what occurs in capital cities. So people, look and see around themselves that housing is in a real tight spot, and in regions. But the impulse is to say, look at affordability, look at prices, and it's very true that in regions prices have been growing very significantly, but housing markets in regions, I don't mean to be sort of pejorative in this way, but I think they're sort of an upside down situation of what occurs in capital cities. So in capital cities, Sydney and Melbourne in particular, affordability and purchase markets are in such a malaise, in terms of for first home buyers to be able to enter those markets. Whereas in regions, yes, prices have been increasing significantly, and that presents a lot of challenges, particularly for local people on those lower incomes, to enter into those markets if they're not already in there. But the real malaise is in their rental markets. So their regional rental markets are quite thin. There's just not that availability.
Yeah.
And there's a real sort of symbiotic relationship here with the provision of services that Laura's piece really pointed out is really significant in those decisions to move, and a sort of barrier to moving to regions is the provision of essential services. And what we're finding at the moment, both in rental markets and purchase markets, is for those key workers, if they're sort of aspiring to be homeowners in a lot of regional areas, those regional housing prices have been increasing by in the order of sort of 30% per annum, and key worker wages are definitely not increasing by that same rate. And so key workers are really being priced out of those of an increasing number of local communities. And then when you look at the rental markets in regions, there's just not that availability to be able to accommodate those essential workers, those key workers that these communities really need. So it's so foundational, really. So it's a real challenge. I can understand the kind of impulse within regions, especially those places that are growing strongly, to say, wherefore we can't take any more. But when we look at jobs at the Institute here, and we track job vacancies, and a lot of those vacancies are for those health workers, those sort of essential services, those, community care and service workers that are really sort of that, that glue to community, and, provide, foundational to that community feel that Laura's research really highlighted. So the key here is just to address these housing challenges. And for us at the Institute, we just think that these issues, they cascade through the sort of continuum of housing, such that it's the most vulnerable who bear the brunt of those pressures. And so for us, we think that's really the policy priority, is to be addressing that sort of a social and affordable housing in regions.
Yeah. Good. I'm going to shift gears a little bit now. Thanks for that conversation we've just had. It's a lot to think about, and certainly a lot of future policy work to be done. Talking about, I guess, some of the dynamics of population movements is what I want to look at next. And there was an interesting question in the chat there around, we've been talking a lot about movement between capital cities and regional centres, but the issue was raised around, I guess, rural Australia, and to what extent the movement into regional centres is coming not from capital cities, but from more rural or more remote places into cities. Can you talk a little bit about that? Are we seeing movement in that direction as well? And how does that sort of fit into the dynamic of movement in that relationship between the capitals or the big cities and the regional places? Avish, I might go to you.
I was afraid you might. To be honest, we didn't really look at movements from smaller towns or rural towns. And that's just primarily because the volume of movement is really just not that large. So we looked at it in a preliminary analysis, and it just felt like a drop in the ocean, honestly, compared to what was happening between the big cities, etc. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. Sure. I know Aria has done some work, so Diva might have some insight there.
Yeah, but that's interesting in itself, hearing that. Yeah. Diva, did you want to add anything to that? And I think Laura might have something to say as well. And you're mute, Diva.
I'll go. And then
you jump in, Laura.
Look, I think it's a really important question, and it's something that shouldn't get lost. Obviously, a lot of the policy focus is on moving people out of the major cities. But my understanding from the evidence I've seen is that certainly we're also seeing that consolidation in regional areas as well. And I think that quite appeals to policymakers, because it does make your life easier if you have a handful of hubs that you're really focused on providing services to. So I think the New South Wales government sort of said that's a part of their strategy, is to sort of support key regional centres as part of that shift. It raises some really, really interesting and challenging policy questions, because it means that other parts of regional Australia are shrinking as a result. Yeah. And that is something we've seen for some time. We talked about Whyalla, but in various regional areas. And managing that is incredibly difficult, because it doesn't work neatly where everyone says, okay, time to go. Some people leave, economic opportunities leave, but then some people stay. And so how you actually continue to support those people who stay is a real challenge. Planning has been a little bit blind to this issue. I think, there tends to be a focus on how do we manage growth, and we don't do as much thinking about how do we manage population decline. More of it overseas, places like the Rust Belt and Eastern Europe and other areas. But I think it's something that we need to talk about more in the Australian context, because the places that aren't growing, I think very much feel like they're being ignored, and that the challenges that creates for them are being overlooked.
Diva, I'll switch to you, because obviously the Institute there is interested not only in the growing places, but also all regional places, I would think. So what are the thoughts around around that question of decline in some areas, and is this are we just stepping back and allowing natural selection to occur, or are we going to try and intervene in some fashion to maintain services and quality of life in places where populations are declining?
Yeah, and I think the key here is place-based approaches. So that's sort of been emphasised around the group here. I mean, just in terms of the planning response and that interesting question of in some areas planning for decline, it's not something that's necessarily wrestled with in the same way that planning for growth is. But I'm speaking a bit out on a limb here because I don't have the sort of details or the study at hand. But I do understand that there are some examples where local planners have looked at that, and they have looked at how you do plan for decline and how you go about sort of switching off infrastructure and services sort of on the peripheries of your towns. I think for some reason Broken Hill is coming to mind, but I mean, I could be very much corrected on that. I mean, I suppose that's something that is just sort of missing in that discussion. But having said that, I mean, many years ago, I think there was this idea that some of these small urban places, that they would be subject to these whims of natural selection, and they would sort of slowly decline over time. But there are instances of having these sort of satellite towns of these major cities where actually, for some income earners, that affordability within these sort of larger regional cities has meant that actually there's been the encouragement of movement to those sort of surrounding satellite towns. There are examples, of smaller regional areas that do act as those sort of satellite areas that where people do, commute into those, your Albury Wodongas or your Wollongong's. And I think maybe that might be a bit of a feature coming out of the pandemic because of these disruptions to local housing markets.
Yeah. I want to talk quickly, we are sort of getting into the last 10 minutes of the webinar, but I was keen that we also have a bit of a chat around the environment and particularly climate change and its impacts, which often are felt more heavily in regional places. Obviously the floods recently in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland come to mind, but just before the pandemic, of course, we had some massive and atrocious bushfires that very, very profoundly affected many regional places. And there was conversation then around, what does this mean for regional Australia? And then we had a pandemic, and it seemed to completely turn that conversation around. So let's sort of, I guess, discuss that question of climate resilience and its impact in regional places. And Laura, I kind of want to go to you first, because you were talking to people in those places. Is this something that was discussed? Are people concerned about bushfire risk, flooding risk? What are the conversations that are happening in regional places about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, as you said, that the timing of the research means that maybe this doesn't get as much airspace as it normally would or should. We went into it thinking this would be a topic that would come to the fore, and then COVID became kind of more consuming. And I think this got pushed a little bit to the side. So I suspect, if you went back now with things that have happened recently with floods and other things, you might find that these issues came up. I think that the way that it did come through in the conversations we had were around those tensions between growth and maintaining, the natural environment and protecting the natural benefits of the broader region that these cities were sitting in. So it was less about climate change that in the way that the conversations happened that we had, and more about those sort of tensions between growth and environment, I guess.
Vish, I can't remember now on that table you had up earlier whether this was a factor in people's decision to move or not to move to places.
Yeah, we actually asked a separate question where we showed them 8 or 9 different natural disasters and asked them to rate their importance in terms of when they'd want to move. And from memory, I think about more than half of the population said that fires, floods, and droughts were definitely an important consideration. I should mention, otherwise the environmental economists that I work with are going to scold me, that droughts aren't natural disasters, they're man-made disasters. So we shouldn't necessarily include them in the same conversation. But yeah, floods and fires were definitely an important consideration for more than half the population.
Mm. And was that influencing decision making, or yeah,
that's a really
causal impact?
Yeah, I mean, what was interesting was it didn't necessarily play out in any significant way when it came to specific preferences for a large city or a small city. So if you remember those 4 segments that I identified, there weren't different concerns for different natural disasters across those 4 segments. Pretty much all 4 segments roughly care equally about it. So it doesn't necessarily play out in terms of high level preferences. I think it plays out more in terms of the specifics. All right, if I'm going to live in Sydney, do I want to be close to a place where coastal erosion might be an issue or not? It's more localized, is my feeling.
Mm.
Just to add something there, Tom, the other way this did come in was, and it's a sort of brings us back around to housing, is in the question of insurance.
Yes.
And particularly in Cairns, that was something that was really front of mind. And I think, again, it speaks to that point that Diva was making about the fact that we need to look at the housing challenge as a whole kind of complex entity, not just how much does it cost to buy, because you can have the most affordable housing in the world, but if you can't insure your property, then that will make it very, very difficult for people to move to that regional area. So that is clearly, again, we've seen discussions in the aftermath of what's happened in places like Lismore about whether people are going to be able to get insurance anymore. And if we don't factor that into the thinking about the challenges of accessing and maintaining housing, then we're missing a bit of a trick.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are running out of time, so Diva, I will sort of just hand over to you quickly for some final comments. But before I do, I just also wanted to say, some of the other things that did come up that we haven't got around to talking about, just to acknowledge the questions, is that there were questions around transport and commuting. There are questions around health and other forms of social infrastructure in regions too. So a lot of interesting things to keep thinking about and discussing. But Diva, do you have any, before I wrap up, do you have any final remarks that you'd like to make, I guess, around that that resilience question particularly, but anything else?
Yeah, I mean, just in relation to resilience, and that regions, they often are at the forefront of these natural disasters, and we're seeing that increasingly so. What we've found is that the initial response is to these disasters is generally community driven, and that was really on display in Lismore, in part because the sort of policy response just wasn't there. But I think that and that's really integral to an area's resilience. And it goes to this point that we've talked about a lot today in terms of, the role of community, and that it's a significant feature of why people are in regions. And I suppose that really comes to the fore in terms of their resilience to these natural disasters. And the key thing here is for policy to be able to, tap into and use those community networks to support that resilience for local regional areas when they are having to respond to these increasingly to natural disasters. And just sort of concluding sort of thoughts. I mean, the thing that really resonated with me and would resonate for the Institute more generally in terms of this, the pieces of work that Vij and Laura have done is just around that diversity, really honing into the diversity of regional Australia and setting those foundations for place-based responses that to us is what makes policy effective. It's really key to policy being effective, and it's really encouraging to see that sort of foundational work in these pieces shared today.
Thanks, Diva, and look, thank you all. Obviously, some really, really interesting and very wide-ranging issues there that we've covered, and a number that we've obviously barely scratched the surface on. But look, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Vij. Thank you, Diva, for your insights and your input for us all today. We really appreciate that. Thank you to everyone else who's contributed questions and in the chat as well. Again, sorry if we didn't cover off particular questions that you were interested in, but there's so much to touch on here, and obviously so many policy implications in terms of particularly the trends and changes that we've seen in the last couple of years, and which have been captured to some extent through the great research that we've heard presented on today. So thank you again, and thank you everyone else for joining us. We do look forward to bringing you more webinars throughout 2022 as the year moves on, and if you want to make sure that you get notifications about those and invitations in your email, then do subscribe to AHURI News, and the slide on your screen tells you how to do that. A quick reminder finally that we would love to have your feedback on the webinar today, and you'll be sent a short survey if you've registered for the webinar. So please do take a few minutes to complete that. That would be really great and would help us a lot. And as I said, we will be making a recording of this webinar available shortly through the AHURI website. So do feel free to share that with others if you would like to do so. Well, thank you. And until we see you again, either at our next webinar or in person, I'd like to thank you once again for joining us today. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, Tom.